moon tower with some
Exactly.
golden on the top. So that's
Okay,
I really
we're
like
going
it.
out live here now.
Okay.
So
Okay.
just so you know.
That's great. Instead of them just being pillars, they're like
Mhm.
two different identities.
Yes, they were very different identities. Yeah, yeah. It's been quite the journey, as we say.
Mm-hmm.
Can you guys hear that bass in my background? Should I mute?
No,
I don't hear any bass.
Okay.
I don't hear it at all. Not at all.
I was going to say, Annabelle, the poor kids, they're in their 30s across the street, can't afford treble.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
The boom box.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is actually unfortunate because I've read that actually causes nervous system dysregulation as intensely as major trauma. And then
I don't doubt it.
You know, because it's so jarring and so repetitive over such a long period. And they're always a little bit half cocked and angry. And I'm like, well, I guess that's why. Not just because they're young.
Well, yeah. You're aware, aren't you, that if you put an egg on a stage at a rock concert, that it will be hard boiled by the end of the concert, right?
Yeah, just because because of vibrations.
Yeah.
Huh.
So.
No, I didn't know that. Does it matter which rock band is playing?
Nope, doesn't matter.
Just put it in front of the Marshall stack, and there you go.
Okay. All right, folks. Well, we're back online on YouTube. For those of you who are wondering what we're chatting about, we're finishing up chatting about Annabelle's tarot card and
Major Arcana
tarot cards, which are now complete. Are there minor?
Well, now
arcana?
I'm moving on. Yeah, I'm moving on to there's my
okay.
blank, right, ace. And I have to say that my particular Marseille deck, this this Ace of Wands, I think it's one of my favorite cards of any kind that I've ever seen.
Yeah, that's a cool one.
Really.
That is really a cool one. Good evening, Justin. Nice to see you. And
going on.
Yeah, because the wand is not just so slender; it's got that nice.
Exactly, big difference from the Rider-Waite. But yeah, we'll see what happens to this. I don't know, but the journey continues.
Yes, and Jordan and I are going to do perhaps a pop-up tarot reading for everybody in the world at the Confluence. Or rather, Jordan is going to do it, and I'm going to be a participant. And I will run the broadcast out onto YouTube so everybody can see it. But the point of it is that I had an insight about 25 years ago that I could walk into an auditorium with 1,000 people in it and throw the tarot cards across the stage and just read them directly from the stage without even picking them up, let alone putting them in any sort of layout. And everyone in the room would believe that I had done the reading for them. Right. And so we're going to experiment with that assertion.
So my feeling too is that what's interesting is it doesn't matter about the random pull so much as every card can apply to any situation, and every card does apply to every situation. But what I find is that the visual, the images actually then sync up for your imaginative interpretation so that they're not vague and you get specific chords struck to resonate that I think activate the unconscious to well up the contents. And it's interesting to me that every time, the same card can come up over and over and over. And I don't think I've ever said the same thing twice. And, it's not about, reading a book. I mean, I'm not going to pay me to do a bedtime story. It's like,
well, that's what I like about the tarot too. You could just, follow Hemingway's dictum that if you're going to write, you open a vein and bleed.
Yeah.
And that's metaphorical. Nobody do that. This is not a suggestion to anybody.
Right.
But metaphorically, it means that you open your unconscious to give some sort of guidance, and then you go with the flow.
And pour life out onto the page, literally.
Literally. And so
I always find it pretty cool when like I'll get halfway through a reading and I'll have them pick some clarifying cards. And when they pick cards and they look like they planned that with their wardrobe, it's like, you know, it's really pretty cool. And we both immediately they're like, oh wow, I'm wearing this. It's like,
well, I actually got myself a new purple polo shirt. That's what this is, to wear at Helena. I haven't worn it yet. This is my old one. And
oh wow, because I got this recently too. I got three more Guatemalan heavy weave shirts, and this was like the one that jumped first. So I'm still laughing that we both wore purple tonight. It's just like
okay, so we're going to read on in this individuation section. This is our second evening of reading this individuation section, and it may be hard to recognize that that's what it is, but I'm going to let Jordan read the last paragraph that we read last week, which was 269. And then I will take on paragraph 270, which is over a page long. And but I'm not going to just read through it. I'm going to stop from time to time if something needs discussion, I think. So,
yeah, parse out the idea
a little bit. Yeah, it's a little too much otherwise. So you go ahead with 269. That this is just a refresher of how we ended last week.
Yeah, overlap, good segue. The aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. From what has been said in the previous chapters, it should be sufficiently clear what the persona means psychologically. But when we turn to the other side, namely to the influence of the collective unconscious, we find we are moving in a dark interior world that is vastly more difficult to understand than the psychology of the persona, which is accessible to everyone. Everyone knows what is meant by putting on official airs or playing a social role. Though through the persona, a man tries to appear as this or that, or he hides behind a mask, or he may even build up a definite persona as a barricade. So the problem of the persona should present no great intellectual difficulties.
Okay. So does anyone in our group see any intellectual difficulties? Otherwise, we'll go on, since we discussed this last week. Okay. Moving on. Paragraph 270. It is, however, another thing to describe in a way that can be generally understood those subtle inner processes which invade the conscious mind with such suggestive force. Perhaps we best portray these influences with the help of examples of mental illness, creative inspiration, and religious conversion. A most excellent account taken from life, so to speak, of such an inner transformation is to be found in H.G. Wells's book, Christina Alberta's Father. Change of a similar kind changes of a similar kind are described in Leon Dowder's eminently readable Laredo. A wide range of material is contained in William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. Although in many cases of this kind, there are certain external factors which either directly condition the change or at least provide the occasion for it. Yet it is not always the case that the external factor offers a sufficient explanation of these changes of personality. We must recognize that the fact that they can also arise from subjective inner causes, opinions, convictions, where external stimuli play no part at all or a very insignificant one. In pathological changes of personality, this can even be said to be the rule. The cases of psychosis that present a clear and simple reaction to some overwhelming outside event belong to the exceptions. Hence, for psychiatry, the essential etiological factor is the inherited or acquired pathological disposition. The same is probably true of most creative intuitions, for we are hardly likely to suppose a purely causal connection between the falling apple and Newton's theory of gravitation. Similarly, all religious conversions that cannot be traced back directly to a suggestion and contagious example rest upon independent interior processes culminating in a change of personality. As a rule, these processes have the peculiarity of being subliminal, i.e., unconscious, in the first place, and of reaching consciousness only gradually. The moment of eruption can, however, be very sudden, so that consciousness is instantaneously flooded with extremely strange and apparently quite unsuspected contents. That is how it looks to the layman and even to the person concerned, but the experienced observer knows that psychological events are never sudden. In reality, the eruption has been preparing for many years, often for half a lifetime, and already in childhood, all sorts of remarkable signs could have been detected, which in more or less symbolic fashion hinted at abnormal future developments. I am reminded, for instance, of a mental case who refused all nourishment and created quite extraordinary difficulties in connecting with nasal feeding. In fact, an anesthetic was necessary before the tube could be inserted. The patient was able, in some remarkable way, to swallow his tongue by pressing it back into the throat, a fact that was quite new and unknown to me at the time. In a lucid interval, I obtained the following history from the man. As a boy, he had often revolved in his mind the idea of how he could take his life, even if every conceivable measure were employed to prevent him. He first tried to do it by holding his breath until he found that by the time he was in semi-conscious state, he had already begun to breathe again. So he gave up these attempts and thought perhaps it would work if he refused food. This fantasy satisfied him until he discovered that food could be poured into him through the nasal cavity. He therefore considered how this entrance might be closed, and thus it was that he hit upon the idea of pressing his tongue backwards. At first, he was unsuccessful, and so he began a regular training until at last he succeeded in swallowing his tongue in much the same way as sometimes happens accidentally during anesthesia. Evidently, in his case, by artificially relaxing the muscle at the root of the tongue. Okay, that I did get through it all. And I'm going to go find something on my on my photos. So Jordan and Annabelle, I'm going to leave it to you to discuss this for the time being.
Certainly. I love the line at the end of page 175 towards or paragraph 270 at the end of that page. In reality, the eruption has been preparing for many years, often half a lifetime, and already in childhood all sorts of remarkable signs could have been detected. And it's interesting to me there it really reminds me of volcanic life cycles, or the life cycles of a volcano. You see it, rising up, you feel it in the seismic waves pressurizing. And in a sense, that's a psychological evolution of growing the mental real estate, so to speak, I think. So I love that the eruption, he uses IRR instead of ER, but the half a lifetime, these are kind of like personal geological cycles that you can see happening over time if you allow yourself to notice the change instead of trying to stay with what's stable or allegedly stable.
Mm-hmm.
Annabelle, your thoughts on this paragraph?
Well, I was taken more with some of the earlier parts of the paragraph, especially where it's that contrast between what comes from the inside and what comes from the outside, what's inherited and what is it that a person takes on. I inhabit a community, I guess, is the easiest way to put it, where there are a lot of poets. Mm-hmm. And many of those poets identify in various ways as a sort of almost like a badge of their sort of credential of what makes them a poet. Mm-hmm. And it rarely has to do with the actual work. It more often has to do with something else about either eccentricity or something of, I read poetry books or something that has to do with outside of them. Very rarely is it something that comes from actually within. And the paragraph, Skip, that you read before, the aim of individuation paragraph, talked about a mask or a masquerade. Mm-hmm. And that sense of, at a certain point in one's life, taking on something that might be a mask, and saying, this is who I am. And then kind of living up to that is something that I encounter every now and then. And just recently, I encountered a young man, and he's probably about 40 years old, who claims to be a poet, claims to identify with many of the poets who sort of, went off the deep end, and identifies also with people who live in insane institutions, and just when I encountered him the other day, talked a lot about Pilgrim State Hospital on Long Island, where there are 30,000 people who live there, and as if that was some, kind of subculture of the population where a large percentage, by his identification, were actually creative souls like himself, right? Mm-hmm. So it's an identification with a fringe of society rather than what one would call normal. So that's what I heard from both of these paragraphs, the long one and also the one before. Mm-hmm. And it brings up some dangers, but it also brings up some access to higher consciousness, let's call it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because Colleen recently mentioned a study done on institutionalized schizophrenics and MFA students, graduate students. And they scored the same across the board pretty much, except the one difference was the MFA students typically had a higher ego strength, so they didn't get dissolved in the intensity. And the schizophrenics had no boundaries. They didn't have an ego strength. And the content and the substance of their thinking and their feeling and their creativity was almost, she said, identical. But the difference was that the MFA students had ego strengths. So in a sense, you get the graduate school for schizophrenics is the institution, and the graduate school for creatives is the MFA program or life out here. The crazy monkey business of that.
Master of Fine Living, MFL maybe.
Yeah, MFL. There you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
Eat the good food. It's. But I thought that was interesting, and so you bringing that up, inside versus outside, is that it feels that ego strength. The MFA students could keep a perspective, and in a sense, you can hold two ideas without making a decision, and you don't get all bent by the contrast or pushed around and buffeted by the winds of change, so to speak. Whereas the schizophrenics would just get sent off into this roller coaster tsunami of their own inner workings. And in a sense, I would say that's more childish, where you're easily influenced in a way, whereas the MFA students were more childlike, where they're like, oh, cool, curious, let's have wonderment, and it's really intense, and oh, the weather's pretty strong today, instead of just getting blown around every which way.
Right.
Yeah.
But then again, who's to say, right? I mean, we're reading Jung because we, I think, feel some trust. If I can grab a word from, the encyclopedia, in Jung's evaluation or observations.
Yeah.
Well, and I feel that Jung helped me understand that I'm not crazy. Okay.
Right. Good one.
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, I wrote a novel in 1993 that I put in a drawer for 16 years.
Yep.
And or maybe longer than that, 21 years. And I finally published it on Amazon, only on Kindle. But the significance of writing the novel was I actually saw the movie of the novel go by my face, and I have no recollection whatsoever of putting my fingers on the keyboard. And so for a long time I thought, wow, maybe I'm becoming overwhelmed by something in my psyche because certain parts of it are pornographic. And I finally came to the conclusion that no, this is the way we all are. and you can accept yourself, your shadow self. And so one of the interesting things that we're doing with Colleen in Helena is we're going to be doing collages. And I know a lot of people think, oh, well, who wants to do a collage? That's something that you do in kindergarten, right? But the point of it is to let you feel and experience your unconscious pushing through. And once you do it with somebody who's an adept at this, then you can recognize your own creativity and how it comes. Now, for purposes of this evening, I'm not going to show any collage that I've done, but I am going to show another method that Colleen talked about, where she was talking about a mark. And the idea of it is that you take a sheet of paper and you draw a straight line through the piece of paper, and then you draw another line that doesn't like straight lines, and you keep it going as long as you can. And so what came out of me was that, okay, I can't cross this original straight line directly because that would be an intersection that would be breaking things, but I can run parallel to that straight line at certain points and then bring my line around and then go under that line, right? And so that at the end of it, I had basically what looked like a scribble on the page. But then the next step is to color it and color in the spaces. And it's quite an abstract work, but I'm going to show you a couple of these. One of them is this one, which I think is fairly powerful. And you can see my straight line is right down here. It starts there and it goes right down here. And it comes right down to the end. And so then I started to draw lines that went along that line and kept, and so I never crossed a single line, only double lines. And what happens is that you get an incredible abstract image out of it that's pretty powerful, I think, in terms of colors. And I'll give you another couple of examples.
And that one's really powerful. It's like an internal hall of mirrors. I mean, it has a lot going on.
Right. And here's another one that's kind of interesting. And this is called Hopes. But as I was looking at it smaller here, Hopes for 2021 is what this is supposed to be. So she said, draw a line. So the straight line is here. And I was trying to express what my hopes for 2021 were. And this is what I got. And when I looked at it small just now, it almost looks like a girl peeking around a wall or something.
Mm-hmm. And like a hood, right?
Right. And then here, this one is really interesting. Again, I drew just a straight diagonal line right down here, and then started with the other line. And when it's black and white, you don't see anything. But now when I color it in, look at the face that's there, huge face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there's a couple of others here. Yes, this is one in which I ended up getting a hot air balloon going up, and the straight line is here. And then, but that idea of mine, these were about the election. And that idea of mine of not crossing any straight line, but I could go under it, allowed me to build out, quite an impressive portfolio of things. I'm just going to look at, see if I have, okay, here's another good one. So this is a series, and let's see. Okay, so I imagined that I would do a series of straight lines that didn't come together. And so this was them, but then this is the image that started to emerge from that. And it gets differentiated as we go across, and it gets more and more interesting as the color is added. And then, this one is another one from the same sort of series, but this one was actually based on the movie A Call to Spy. And that movie is about Virginia Hall. And Virginia Hall was a spy during World War II. She had a artificial leg that she called Cuthbert. It weighed 7 pounds and it was hollow. But she was the leading spy of the Allies during World War II. And so now the chief training base of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States is called Virginia Hall, named after her. And so this represents on one side the colors of the red, white, and blue, and the bleu, blanc, et rouge of the French, and her kernel of self got squeezed harder and harder while she was fighting in the war, and then things emerged on the other side. And so I don't recall the whole story that I pulled out of this, but this is my image of Virginia Hall after probably the day I saw the movie, or maybe the next day. I think it was the day I saw the movie. And so again, this came out of this general idea of not crossing any lines, but that's only my idea. Okay. And everybody does that differently. But when you're drawing those lines, you actually pay attention to your unconscious, and it tells you where to make the lines.
Mm-hmm.
And
I remember well that and the line that doesn't like straight lines.
Yeah.
And then the coloration began, and immediately there were two faces that I started to see, and then this embryo, this orange golden embryo, that then in the next series turned into this cross section of the human head, like a sagittal section, right down the center vertically, and all black with gold, and 7 fingers here, 7 fingers there, all these little kind of villi from the intestine, but psychologically almost like the, I guess, corpus callosum. I guess it's the edge of the wrinkly folds of the brain. And I didn't think about this until you were showing me that. And I remember that I was doing that at the same time you were doing those. But I look at it now, and that was one season, like 3 months before I woke up in January last year and turn my life upside down and shake it really hard, and get into that living in the deep, and systematically upheaved, and here I am here. And I hadn't thought about that.
You moved across the country.
Yeah. And set up a table on the plaza,
Right.
So it's interesting how
I'm not
prefiguration.
Complaining I'm not saying that what I did was great art. It's what I did. Okay. And I found it quite moving. And I'm sure some professional artists could take it farther along, and in fact Tim did, and a few others did, but
I was surprised just now when I saw those again, that like some things like Leftovers, they were more intense just now. And there was more of I saw a stronger inner life in them now than last year. It was more ooh and ah and wow, and I'm just kind of taking it in for the first time, but now
we were looking at 30 different people's emanations from their unconscious. So
right, one after the other, right.
So Annabella, I'm just curious whether those were meaningful to you at all, or
they're very meaningful to me, and I do a lot of collage myself. I also do a lot of drawings from my own dreams. And your last image, when you showed us the very first part of it, the two lines coming down, right? And then circle, that resembled very much a dream drawing that I did recently. So that was a wonderful kind of connection to make with what you were talking about. Sometimes I color in my dream drawings, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to remember something from the dream. For example, I had a dream the other night, and there was a very shapely umbrella that then the next day I saw a building that is the city hall of a town hall of a tiny little town called Chatham upstate. And I saw that they had a new cupola, and it was shaped exactly the way the shape in my dream was. But in my dream, it was a very bright yellow, and this cupola was a very dark green. And that made me think about, the relationship between those two, because that's very much what's going on with my dreams, is they're sort of interacting with my waking life. But
which
the other
thing which they would. That's what
well,
they
of course they do, yeah.
Right.
But the other thing, sorry, I'm leaving the screen, but only because and I almost feel as though I have spoken about this before. So this is a little plastic envelope, right? Package of words. And this is not exactly collage, but there's a similar, right? This is actually a whole phrase, right? Which I cut out, obviously, because my father had died, and I saw a phrase. Oh, what was that phrase? Memories. Here's another one. Crisp, quiet, and still, right? They're just whatever kind of reaches out to me, but many of them are just single words. On. Embrace.
That's
hold. And what I do with these is that, if I was, in that William James point of view, I put myself into a frame of mind, and then I sit down and I spread some words out, and then I rearrange them, and magically, as if I'm doing a Ouija board, right? I come up with a poem. But I actually don't do it quite that, spookily, kind of new agey. What I do is I know that the reason why I have chosen any combination of words is because they spoke to me.
Truly.
And then I begin to compose. I mean, I am a writer, but I'm also a typesetter. I'm also a typist. I'm also an editor. My 9-to-5 job at the moment is editing random words. Some of them are crazy ones, like anakinra and that alopecia word, or these crazy, most of them are what they call adverse reactions from pharmaceutical drugs, because that's who pays me to do my editing, is these pharmaceutical people for the moment. But I have many poems like this, and it would take me a moment to go and get one and show you, but you can imagine. I mean,
I can imagine easily.
It's remarkable. And one recent poetry reading I gave, they asked me, oh, do you want to have something projected behind you? And I said, sure. And there was one of my poems, which I had glued onto an image of a road, because being on a road related to the words I was relating to, that I was not relating to, the words I was responding to. So instead of me composing words, it's kind of like the words compose me.
Right.
And that's
they
how
do
I
that.
relate to what you were doing.
Right. Okay. So the point is, it's coming up from the unconscious through some artifice that we're using to bring it up, and you can't predict what it's going to be. I mean,
not at all.
Nobody thought of either one of these discussions.
This work that I
session.
do this way surprises me in tremendous ways, and
I'll bet.
really rich and then other people, when they hear it, respond a lot. Yeah. So
Right. And you know, years ago I wrote quite a bit of poetry, and I took this class on poetry writing, and the trick that they taught was that you think of, you know, sort of a central idea that you want to talk about, or a single word, and then from that you create a web that comes out. So, you know, if you pick any word, teacher, you know, you can go out in one direction and it's school, and in one direction it's pain, and another direction it's you know, imagery or what have you, and it goes. You know, it's pretty easy to fill up a page with any word, and so I sort of stopped it when it became a party trick. Okay, because I came to the point where I knew I could do it on at the drop of a hat. You give me any word and I can write a villanelle about it, right? And the way that works is you take the word that you give, and I start drawing this spider web out from that word. And as I'm doing it, a sentence with 20 syllables will come to my head, will come into my mind. Well, or, you know, basically either a long sentence or two sentences, whatever it is. And once that happens, because the essence of a villanelle is rhyming sentences that repeat over and over again, right? And so once that happens, then you can, then all you have to do is find out what are the rhyming words at the end of the line, and figure out every word that rhymes with those rhyming words, and use them in the next verse. It just, you know, it just writes itself. It's incredible. So I'll give you an example. I wrote a lot of seductive poetry. So you'll excuse me. I wrote a book called Seduction for the Soul, and it has 50 poems in it. And one favorite poem is called Symphony, and so that was the original word, symphony, and so this is how it came out, with the first and third line now being the two lines that go together. I want to play you like a symphony, draw rosin bow across your silken breast, with driving rhythms from the timpani. Okay, and as you can see, it's quite poetic, and it also has rhythm and meter to it, which villanelles do. And but anyway, that's how, in that case, I could draw from my unconscious and pull the word together, or the poem together, because, you know, I said, okay, well, what are the components of a symphony? I guess I can, now that I've raised it, I should probably read that poem. It only takes a minute to read it, but
what I think is really interesting about that is you are really also playing the distinction of a lot of people have rhyme as a gimmick, and, you know, God help the artist who has a gimmick, but you have substance and story that is expressing, and that's
right.
Then poetry instead of gimmickry. And I really appreciate that, because there's even the cadence and the rhythms are very sensual, sexual, and really move to the heartbeat of what the words are expressing, so that the concept is not just in the words, it's also in the rhythm and the meter. And it feels that that's a lot of things that are similar expressed differently, that are expressed together.
Right.
I guess consistency of theme throughout the different modes of what makes the poem a poem.
Right. Okay. So here's the Villanelle. So the point is that the first and third line of every verse rhymes, and the middle line of every verse rhymes with the middle line of every verse. Okay. And so here it is. Symphony. I want to play you like a symphony. Draw rosin bow across your silken breast with driving rhythms from the timpani. I'll guide you far from life's cacophony to hidden valleys, Mozart's sweet bequest. I want to play you like a symphony. Molten cello will conjure sylvan sea before brass cymbals bring the waves to crest with driving rhythms from the timpani. Oboes kiss the brass with breath so gently that woodwinds whisper lovers' firm request. I want to play you like a symphony. Until our tension passes middle C, just one crescendo frees, life's hurts redressed, with driving rhythms from the timpani. Warm string vibrations guide infinity across our honeysuckle minds abreast. I want to play you like a symphony with driving rhythms from the timpani. And so, I wrote that poem on a walk. On a walk with my dog one day. And I came back to the house and I had to sit down and write it down. And it just popped out of my head. And, you don't have to say whether it's good or bad. I know it's good.
No,
and moreover, it works. It connects. And that's the key thing about poetry, is that before I went on that walk, I had no idea that poem was in my psyche, but then wow, there it was. And so it's only a question of trusting the process. And this is what Colleen Kibert teaches us. And she'll be teaching us with the collage and with other means at the confluence, because this is her gift, teaching the process of artistic process, right? So anyway, but it's what she's doing is she's teaching us how to hear our own unconscious. And so when William James writes Varieties of Religious Experience, he's actually just saying, well, there are all kinds of ways to have a religious experience, and here are 50 of them, right? Did anything like this ever happen to you? And of course, everybody knows that, but that I've had a lot of religious experiences. I have them almost daily. And, and I no longer think as William James did. I mean, William James was a pastor, and he had the idea of the ineffable God giving us these experiences. I agree with that. Fine. I have no objection to his point, but I also know that they come from within us, and that's where that is.
Well, I remember in 1991, actually December 2nd, 1991, I was leaving college to go somewhere I'd never been, to do something I'd never done. And I was moving to Denver to paint in oils and watercolors, which I'd never done. I mean, I did maybe a fox in kindergarten, but that's not really count. But out of nowhere, 2 hours into the trip, about halfway, little over a third of the way there, a blizzard came out of nowhere. And a friend of mine who was helping me move, who was in his car in front of me, and I, come to a kind of crawl you're just going really slow because you can hardly see more than 30 feet in front of your car, if that. And at what point, in a pitch black, and at one point I just stopped the car. And I don't know what it was about just the rhythm of being slow and going into this unknown. And he stops. He said, he gets out. Are you having car problems? I said, no, it's a poem I have to write. And he's like, oh, God damn it, Jordan. You're in the blizzard. And I pulled out a pencil and stood in front of the headlights, on my hood. And I wrote a poem that I never memorized and I've never forgotten. And it was called A Prayer. Mm-hmm. And I always thought it was to someone else, but I realized it was from me to myself. And it went, there comes one whom I know like wind, like rain upon the water. And as winter comes and our memories freeze together may we sleep and dream. So that come the springtime, as we melt together with open eyes, so that come the springtime. Wow, this is the first time I've ever forgot it. I like that. Yeah. So that come the springtime, as we embrace with open eyes, may we melt back together in each other's arms. Amen. And it was called A Prayer. But I realized, years later, that was my letter to myself for what I was doing right then. And I laughed that I put it out so clearly and had no grok of it whatsoever, that was just simply a mirror of the power of what I was doing. And maybe because I was, in a little bit of overwhelm. But yeah, so that kind of, where did it come from kind of thing. And I love that it just came from within.
Right. And so these, although Dr. Jung here is talking about a spectrum that goes from psychosis, through the artistic personality into, whatever, into a logos style life, I guess. The point is that all of us have these, bursts of inspiration, let's say. They come to us every night in dreams. They come to us during some day in visions. And some people have the wits to write them down. Yeah. Right, Annabelle? You must know lots of people like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so the point that I want to make to the YouTube audience here is, just because things like this come to you, whether they come in the form of a image that you paint or have to scribble out, or a series of words that becomes a poem, or what have you, it doesn't make you crazy, right? You're not crazy. And what the Red Book is Dr. Jung trusting that process in himself, and just letting ideas like that run. And when he was first doing it in the 19 teens, 100 years ago, he thought he might be having a psychotic episode. And I know that there's some Jungian analysts who say that he was having a psychotic episode. I don't think so, really. I mean, I think he was tapping in to his unconscious wellspring. I don't know. What do you think of that, Annabelle?
It's the process. I mean, I can't say I'm any sort of expert about the Red Book, but it doesn't strike me as, the ravings of a lunatic, any more than, for example, one of my favorite writers who wrote both poetry and prose, and I like his letters a lot too, is a Swiss writer named Robert Walser, who lived much of his life in a, whatever you want to call it, asylum. and did most of his writing while confined in that sort of way. And he's one of the most important writers of the 20th century by, many people's consideration. So I don't discount one thing or the other thing. You see what I mean? Yeah. Being in, again, it's like I talked about this writer who I encountered recently, and the way that so many of the poets who I know, the unfortunate thing is that way that some artists feel that they have to push themselves to the edge, right?
Yeah.
Whether
they do it artificially,
whether it's using substances or whether it's artists who are hurting themselves or asking other people to hurt them or doing whatever. Anyway,
finding a way to get some emotion.
And finding a way to express something that is universal because they feel that universality is going to be touched on when it's extreme, right?
Right. Yeah, and so it's like Henry Miller, who went over the edge and couldn't get back. He was drunk. He became a drunk, and Jackson Pollock is another example. Who
so many.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen.
I'm not sure. I mean, Jackson Pollock died in a car accident. I mean, it wasn't.
Well, he was.
We could
drunk.
say he was doomed to have the car accident because he was drinking so much of the time that sooner or later something was gonna. But I don't know. I mean,
well, he was, his physical life was out of control. I mean, he drove off a cliff with two young women, killed them too, and he was drunk when he did it. And it wasn't that. It wasn't that he was out on a long drive and accidentally went off the road. It was like 2 miles from his house or very close to his house. And he just got drunk and got these two girls in the car with him and went off the cliff. Normal people don't do that. And Dr. Jung's point is that, it's all well and good to go down and examine the unconscious and to do these relatively small tricks that bring things up for you so you feel the process, and now you understand how the process happens within you. Okay, so that's what Colleen does. She shows people process and how it happens, and that you try the process that she's teaching, and sure enough, you can feel these things, and that's enough. That's actually enough, because then you can actually, elaborate from that exponentially, to the ends of the universe, and you don't need liquor or drugs or any other such thing to do that. And
I remember
that's
writing.
What I'm hoping we're saying here, because there are a lot of people that think they need to go out and get drugs to experience a peak experience, but you don't have to do that at all.
Well, addiction, to me, that's then the outward, almost extroverted self-sabotage of addiction. And then the introverted self-sabotage, not meaning introverts only do this, but like I wrote in the devil card in my book, about being comfortable with one's intensities, because inhibitions enslave as easily, if not more easily, than excesses, because they live in blind spots that cause us to be terrified. And it's interesting to me that, say, Pollock, kind of the drunken piece is the self-sabotage externally. He's going to, hit himself from outside. And there's then, to me, the other self-sabotage is the inhibitions that enslave. And to me, the example of that is, it's relatively crazy from my perspective to not listen to these inner things, to not express, to not utilize your creativity, because you're self-sabotaging yourself wondering why you feel like hell. Well, because you're not listening to yourself. And to me, that's inhibition driven, and or ignorance driven, that not that they're ignorant, but that they've never been exposed to, this is something to do. This is something that is healthy for your well-being. And
right. So nowadays, Johns Hopkins University is experimenting with certain psychedelics to see if they can help people. And there's a writer, one of the two writers on Rebel Wisdom. I'm sorry, I don't know his name offhand. I don't remember it. But a couple of weeks ago, he published, he went into an agreement with Johns Hopkins whether he would, that he would go into 5 of these supervised trips, and then write about the experiences. And he did that, and I read, I think the 4th trip, the story of the 4th trip. I think he's doing it as a book finally, but there was a version of it which is out there on the internet. People can research it if they want to. And so, yes, he got into his psyche very quickly by these artificial means. And, I'm not really going to say what his conclusions were, because that's in his article and you can see that. But as you say, Jordan, beware of artificial wisdom gained without experience.
right, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because to me, it's like a marathon runner. You're not going to get off the couch if you've never run and go run a marathon. And then if you don't stop, you'll probably die. Or martial arts, it's intense training over years daily. And train so much that the mind forgets and the body remembers. But then the intensities come and you're prepared for them because you've grown to rise to expect and be those intensities and dance with them. Whereas you come off of no psychological background, no psychological experience in depth psychology, growth, creativity within, or even some art form where you have a discipline of the ritual that prepares you. I think then that's what happens is people get literally blasted, exploded inside. They think, it just blew my mind. It's like, well, yeah, but if you blow a gasket in your car, it's kind of like the same thing. You're going to need some help. And I think preparation is so important.
Right. And so this fellow did it in a very organized manner where, he was making notes as the experience was happening, as a writer would. And the person that was with him was taking him through a 1-hour event. And the guy who was with him would say, okay, we're at 15 minutes or something like that. And he'd be writing down what his impressions were, and that's all well and good to do that in a supervised way. But then the question becomes, if you do that, then what happens a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Do you want to do that artificially again, and maybe not with the supervision of a professional? And then you start to get into issues. So, Annabelle, do you have the book with you there?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Why don't I give you a light load for the moment?
Well, there's a tiny paragraph here, but I could go on and read the next 2 easily.
Okay. Well, why don't you do that? 271, 272.
Yeah. In this strange manner, the boy paved the way for his future psychosis. After the second attack, he became incurably insane. This is only one example among many others, but it suffices to show how the subsequent, apparently sudden eruption of alien contents is really not sudden at all, but is rather the result of an unconscious development that has been going on for years. The great question now is, in what do these unconscious processes consist? And how are they constituted? Naturally, so long as they are unconscious, nothing can be said about them. But sometimes they manifest themselves, partly through symptoms, partly through actions, opinions, affects, fantasies, and dreams. Aided by such observational material, we can draw indirect conclusions as to the momentary state and constitution of the unconscious processes and their development. We should not, however, labor under the illusion that we have now discovered the real nature of the unconscious processes. We never succeed in getting further than the hypothetical as if.
Right. So have you in your career as an editor run into writers who went off the deep end, who couldn't control it once they started the flow? I mean, that's the type of people that Dr. Jung is looking at. He was a psychiatrist. He was an early psychiatrist. And so this individual that he's talking about in this book is someone who has a problem. But have you ever run into it in your career?
Yeah.
And what's the denouement?
There's a number of people. I mean, one we just honored recently at an event. And he went back and forth. Some of it was drugs, some of it was alcohol, but most of it was kind of ego and kind of, it goes back to that word that I was so fascinated by in the paragraph before, the mask or masquerade idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He befriended many extremely wealthy people.
Uh-huh.
And in order to do that, it was like he put on costumes, he was pretending to be something that was very different from what he had been when he grew up. And gosh, I forget how old he was when he died, but roughly 50. And he burned out. And a lot of the burning out was this sort of social thing of and some of those extremely wealthy people took him under their wing and encouraged him to do things like paint large canvases with words all over them, in oil paints. Never sold very much when he was alive, but now they sell.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting about the burnout from the social piece too, because there's if your social life is just as intense as your creative life, they tend to dilute one another and make your social life more crazy and your creative life less intense. There's a dilution, it seems, both ways. And the superficial versus what's the substance that generates the surface becomes just a surface. Like you said, a mask.
A mask, exactly.
Fakery,
Okay,
but at a certain point, it's not fake anymore. That was one of the things that impressed me so much about this young man who I saw this weekend, who I wondered whether he's going to drive himself crazy in the sense of really pushing those limits of identifying as a person who is kind of like qualified to be institutionalized.
Right.
But on the other hand, some artists end up crashing and burning privately and go through a shadow period, a dark night of the soul, and come out of it with great with better art than before, I would say, able to bring up the art.
Yeah, that's a sticky wicket. It makes me think of people like Delmore Schwartz and John Berryman, both of whom died, more or less what you might call alcohol poisoning.
Okay, we have a couple of interesting comments on the YouTube channel. One from Justin, who says, like in Yukio Mishima's novel, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, it's massive gold all the way through, looks pretty from the outside, but has no religious value or even practical use. Interesting. And then Vincent Orozco says, Skip, how is Christianity evolving? Okay. What fun. Okay, let me address this in this way because it's going to come up in Confluence, and that is that in 1970, I was at LZ Baldy in Vietnam as a first lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And LZ Baldy was the combat base for the 5th Marine Regiment, the 5th Marines. And therefore, it had assigned to that base 5,000 Marines. And every Monday morning, the chaplain would come to the commanding officer's briefing, and he would announce how many Marines had attended chapel. And the number would be 11 or 12. Okay, now he had a perfectly nice chapel. He had a chapel up on the hill that was a central part of this base. And it was a bunker, but these chaplains came to Vietnam with plastic stained glass windows so that they could put them in the sandbags, and it would look like a stained glass window, and he had pews and, the whole 9 yards. But he was actually servicing the spiritual needs of only 12 Marines a week as compared to the 4,988 Marines that he wasn't addressing their spiritual needs. Now, the commanding officer, the Colonel Judge, who was the commanding officer of 5th Marines, didn't realize, I'm sure, that something was amiss. Okay, didn't realize that there was something amiss, because he probably figured, and maybe I sort of figured this then, but it's something that's burned into my skull, into the inside of my skull, so it's important. But Colonel Judge probably figured, well, if they don't want to go to church, we're not going to make them go to church. And the answer is obviously, right? But then what are we going to do to support their spiritual needs? And that's the responsibility of the chaplain. Okay, the chaplain he may come from whatever path toward the chaplain corps, but when somebody's dying on the battlefield, you don't force upon them Judaism or Islam or any other such thing. You deal with them in their own faith tradition. And on dog tags in the military, it tells you what the faith tradition is, and that's the chaplain's job to relate to that and help the dying man with his spiritual needs, and to help the person who comes to chapel with his spiritual needs, not to proselytize a specific religion. And so what I'm about and interested in connection with the Confluence is, how can we address the spiritual needs of the world, where we have tremendous spiritual malaise around the world right now, incredible spiritual malaise. And okay, yes, there are lots of people who go to church. A lot of them go to church for community or for networking for their business, whatever that is. But from a spiritual perspective, that's where this experience of mine in Vietnam, it is a truth teller, okay? Because when you were in Vietnam in a combat, rifle battalion or rifle regiment, it wasn't about community. You already had a community around you. You didn't need the chaplain for that. And it wasn't about, getting your law practice going. It was about, how is the spiritual need of these Marines going to be addressed? And interestingly, and maybe if you want to go get a advanced look at our play, it is online. It was performed in 2016 in Zurich by 3 Jungian analysts, and famous ones at that. And so they did perform it, and it's called The Analyst and the Rabbi. It's the name of the play, and it was published by the Asheville Jung Center. It's only an hour-long play. But one of the interesting things about that in that play is that the rabbi talks about how he fulfilled the spiritual needs of his community while they were in a concentration camp. And it had nothing to do with Jewish services. What he says in that play has nothing to do with Jewish services. It has to do with people doing creative things and interacting with one another in creative ways. And so it's a very apt thing that really is what the whole confluence to me is about, is how do we address this spiritual need, which is obviously there. I mean, those 4,988 Marines didn't come back and get religion. I mean, maybe a few of them did, but to me, the chaplain should have been doing what Rabbi Beck did in that circumstance in the concentration camp. And, in retrospect, as I look back on that experience, if I had been Colonel Judge, I would have given the chaplain an unsatisfactory fitness report, because, I was one of those Marines on that combat base. I never saw the chaplain except in those meetings. That's the only time I ever saw him.
I want to thank you for going through the, dealing with someone who's dying, or, someone who's in their last moments, addressed in their way. And pardon earlier, I was kind of holding back my chuckling, because when you said that, it reminded me of Voltaire on his deathbed, where the priest comes in because he had requested last rites, but he wasn't religious. And after he received the last rites, the priest actually said, shall you please go ahead now at this time and renounce Satan and take the Lord into your heart? And he said, young man, now is not the best time to be making new enemies. So I'm sorry, I was trying to hold back the laughter, because that was just cycling in my head when you were having a wonderful compassion and empathy for someone, who's dying, to address them respectfully with their spirituality, their way, rather than trying to impose something on them when they're down.
Yeah, and I did have a Marine die in my arms in Vietnam. It was a very moving experience. He was pretty unconscious, so I couldn't interact with him. But anyway, these spiritual things come to my attention, and they're all related to these artistic issues, and that's why we're talking about art, psychology, and renewal when we talk about our confluence. But anyway, Annabelle, do you have thoughts about what I've said, or shall we go on?
I think we could go on.
Okay.
Shall I
So
read a little more?
yeah, just a second. I just want to say one more thing to Vincent. So Vincent, Christianity is evolving. As long as people's spiritual needs are being fulfilled, I have nothing to say about it. If they're not being fulfilled, that's where I'm troubled. Okay, so in Helena, there about half the churches are fundamentalist churches. They do all kinds of party tricks to get people in the door and bring their wallet. But it's evident if you look at their websites that, probably these preachers are not ordained by any faith tradition. They're just self-appointed preachers who are, basically following the Christian playbook, but pretty likely they didn't go to divinity school. And there are a lot of them. I mean, half the churches that I've looked at, both in Helena and Bozeman, Montana, are like that. But I can't criticize those because the people that go to those churches are having their spiritual needs fulfilled. I can't deny it. Right. And so in answer to Vincent, Christianity is perennial. It's going to be with the human species for thousands of years more. And it is going to evolve. It has evolved, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. The evolved versions of it are wrong. Okay, go ahead, Annabelle.
Oh, okay. No moral mind can plumb the depths of nature, not even the depths of the unconscious. We do know, however, that the unconscious never rests. It seems to be always at work, for even when asleep, we dream. There are many people who declare that they never dream, but the probability is that they simply do not remember their dreams. It is significant that people who talk in their sleep mostly have no recollection either of the dream which started them talking, or even of the fact that they dreamed at all. Not a day passes, but we make some slip of the tongue, or something slips our memory, which at other times we know perfectly well, or we are seized by a mood whose cause we cannot trace, etc. These things are all symptoms of some consistent unconscious activity which becomes directly visible at night in dreams, but only occasionally breaks through the inhibitions imposed by our daytime consciousness.
Right. I would argue with Dr. Jung that we don't dream only at night. I believe that the functions that we are connecting into in dreams are happening all the time, 7/24/365. And that we don't see the dreams during the day, mostly, unless they power through by a vision. We don't see them during the day because they're overwhelmed by the light and by our conscious activity. But nonetheless, they're there. And I know that if I just close my eyes, I can see dreams going on all the time. I don't know if you've had that experience, but what do you think? Can't hear you, Jordan.
There we go. The bass across the street got a little high, so I muted. I like, he says, the unconscious never rests. So yeah, in a sense, that is not just like the ocean, that is our inner ocean. So, it's always going on, whether you're thinking about it or not. And so it doesn't, even when, I think when Goethe said, never hurry, never rest, that wasn't a, run yourself to, your fingers are bare. It wasn't burn yourself out. It was a description of the creative process. I think that never hurry, never rest. It's not even go slow to go faster. It's that deep well is still always there, and it's always active. And it's when we access it maybe more at night because it's dark. It's easier to see dark and dark. Whereas in the light, in the sense, it can get washed out. I love the line, the inhibitions imposed by our daytime consciousness. There's a certain rationality of that is an inhibition, rationality imposed over the unconscious. It would seem in that daytime unconsciousness that he's talking about.
Annabelle, what do you think of what I said in response to your paragraph?
Well, I'm not sure about the daytime dreaming, although just because sort of like terminology. I mean, as someone who practices meditation, studied with Kaji lineage teachers, it's kind of a little bit separate. There's a sort of separation there between what I'm doing in my dreams, what I'm discovering about what I'm doing in my dreams. I mean, it's followed in my recent years, it's followed a similar path to this studying the tarot, I mean, painting these cards is a relatively recent development, but it's like in my very early years, starting at age 5, I went to piano lessons. I mean, that developed certain skills and kind of inner abilities or facilities, or I'm not sure what the word would be for that, but it helped with counting. I think I was a math whiz when I was a kid because of those piano lessons. I think that I was, playing this sort of beat the machine game when I first started setting on these fancy equipment. I would just try to jam the machine just for fun because it's working so fast, When I was going to go study guitar, my aunt said you have to study bluegrass because you have those kind of fingers and you have that kind of training that you can just go straight for the crazy stuff, So in recent years, it's this other realm, but I don't think that it's all that much different. And paying attention to dreams, I've always written my dreams down. I mean, I've been keeping a journal since I was about 11. Dreams always went in there. But now what I'm mining in those dreams, what I'm depicting when I draw them, or how I'm paying attention to the language of the dreams is evolving a lot. So that's where I think what you were saying resonated for me.
Yeah.
I think too, there's a beautiful distinction between daydreams, meditation, and then when you have big daydreams, the theosophic visions, which are more intensely numinous. But it's interesting, you mentioned the, try to break the machine. Now, my stepmother was, one of her undergraduate degrees was piano. And she would type at literally 200 words a minute. And the kind of thing, because of, all of the speed that was developed on a lot of complex pieces. But when the computer came along, I mean, there's a point where she had to slow down to not jam the hammers, as they came up on a typewriter. But with a computer, she would look up to edit or read she just sees a blinking cursor, and all of a sudden, because basically she typed faster than the computer could take it, so that she'd have to stop and wait for it to catch up. And it's interesting to me with that kind of thing, with your musical piece that actually enhance your math and your hand-eye coordination, literally.
Yeah.
In a dreamy way, that's a disciplined dream in a way.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Jordan, do you want to take 274?
Sure. So far as our present experience goes, we can lay it down that the unconscious processes stand in a compensatory relation to the conscious mind. I expressly use the word compensatory in quotes and not the word contrary, because conscious and unconscious are not necessarily in opposition to one another, but complement one another to form a totality, which is the italicized self. According to this definition, the self is a quantity that is supraordinate to the conscious ego. It embraces not only the conscious, but also the unconscious psyche, and is therefore, so to speak, a personality, which we also are. It is easy enough to think of ourselves as possessing part souls, hyphenated part souls. Thus we can, for instance, see ourselves as a persona without too much difficulty. But it transcends our powers of imagination to form a clear picture of what we are as a self. For in this operation, the part would have to comprehend the whole. There is little hope of our ever being able to reach even approximate consciousness of the self, since however much we may make conscious, there will always exist an indeterminate and indeterminable amount of unconscious material which belongs to the totality of the self. Hence, the self will always remain a supraordinate quantity.
Right. Okay. And so I want to emphasize supraordinate, supra as in the opposite of super. Super would be outside, like Superman. We can see him go around, but supra is within us. And it would be very interesting to be in touch with and have some connection with the men that are in that steel plant in Ukraine now, who are now alone. The civilians are gone and are being called upon to replicate the Alamo, which is a traditional American story. And, you know, what comes from the unconscious to have those men do that, right? And have the courage to do it.
You know, and it's interesting. I think that's with the Alamo. And then when he's the last line, hence the self will always remain a supraordinate quantity. To me, again, there's the oceanic scale of, you know, the ocean. I mean, how big that is. And to me, the inner infinity of our own psyche, our own personal unconscious, the outer infinity of the ocean. Where then I think we mentioned this in answer to Job, where God is reality, not some thing. And
Right.
The incomprehensible need not be chased down to fully comprehend, but it's that lifelong curiosity and wonderment where we continue to swim in our ocean. We tend to have those experiences. And I think back to the substance addiction and the inhibition, you know, the hidden substance of the unseen or by morals or what have you, goes back to when what's author of Ulysses, James Joyce, when he asks Carl Jung, you know, about his daughter, and she's having such a terrible time, and Jung famously said, Mr. Joyce, where you so easily swim, she is drowning. And
Right.
I think there's that whole, you know, she's suffering in a sense. Maybe she was modeling him, but she wasn't set up for it.
Right. And so I can also say that, you know, basically all people that are involved in military action are at some level, at least, very much like those Mariupol people. Okay. Because you know, I've written a check up to including my life. I wrote it multiple times. I took the oath 7 times in my Marine Corps career. So, and, you know, if you wanted me to unpack that, I couldn't do it. But nonetheless, to me, it was the right thing to do. And so far it worked out for me. But, you know, and it may work out for those men as well. Who knows? But, you know, it's hard work, but somebody's got to do it, I guess. Answer, because there is a military objective there, and that is that these guys are tying up 12 battalions of the Russian forces who can't leave. They have to stay there and keep trying to get them out. And I guess, during the Cold War, they built some pretty good bunkers down there.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you want to take 275, Jordan?
Sure. Paragraph 275. The unconscious processes that compensate the conscious ego contain all those elements that are necessary for the self-regulation of the psyche as a whole. On the personal level, these are not consciously recognized personal motives which appear in dreams, or the meanings of daily situations which we have overlooked, or conclusions we have failed to draw, or affects we have not permitted, or criticisms we have spared ourselves. But the more we become conscious of ourselves through self-knowledge and act accordingly, the more the layer of the personal unconscious that is superimposed on the collective unconscious will be diminished. In this way, there arises a consciousness which is no longer imprisoned in the petty, oversensitive, personal world of the ego, but participates freely in the wider world of objective interests. This widened consciousness is no longer that touchy, egotistical bundle of personal wishes, fears, hopes, and ambitions, which always has to be compensated or corrected by unconscious counter tendencies. Instead, it is a function of relationship to the world of objects, bringing the individual into absolute, binding, and indissoluble communion with the world at large. The complications arising at this stage are no longer egotistic wish conflicts, but difficulties that concern others as much as oneself. At this stage, it is fundamentally a question of collective problems, which have activated the collective unconscious because they require collective rather than personal compensation. We can now see that the unconscious produces contents which are valid not only for the person concerned, but for others as well. In fact, for a great many people, and possibly for all.
Right. Okay.
My great mystery right now is I'm all this flashy. It looks like I'm about to teleport somewhere with the background.
Yes.
I don't know if you're seeing the same thing.
Yeah,
it's
well, I am seeing it. Yep, we are seeing it.
So if I just disappear, hopefully I'll sign into Zoom wherever I reappear.
Okay.
This is interesting about moving to childlike, which is curious, from childish, that no longer that touchy, egotistical bundle of personal wishes, and fears and hopes, and that undeveloped ego strength in a way where it's comfortable with community.
Yeah, as you were reading there, I got what came to my mind, and getting interested in what comes to mind, partially because of the play, is the 4 questions of value in life. There are only 4 questions that are worth anything in life. Okay, and these are the 4 questions of Don Juan DeMarco in the movie by the same name. And the questions are: what is sacred? Of what is the spirit made? What is worth living for? And what is worth dying for? And the answer to all 4 is the same, only for love. It's a very powerful idea. Mm-hmm. And it's animated me through much of my life. So, Annabelle, do you have any further thoughts there?
Not.
Okay.
Special thoughts.
All right.
Except for this Jordan getting transported.
Yeah, this is kind of weird.
Space planet that's definitely developing. And I like the spiral binding. I don't know if you can see that, Jordan, but you have a spiral binding. So you're within a book, but you are also heading out into the cosmos at the same
Well,
time.
and the background is my house that I did in my thesis. So I laugh that I'm in the book in front of my house inside. So there's a lot of, I love that when you pull that.
So you're inside that house?
No,
The
that's
house
the
that
house
we
that I'm going to build.
constructed?
That I did that house during my thesis in architecture in college, and it's come back up as I want to buy property and build it.
Okay.
So
Is
yeah,
that
so
roof with the sort of petals around it? Is that going to be thatched, or is that going to be?
no, that's most likely actually concrete, and then this
The
little
roof
bitty
concrete?
light slivers. I'm going to do it all out of
Wow.
concrete and stone.
Mm.
But with the attempt of using the light like slivers, in a sense, like the Kimball Art Museum with Louis Kahn, where you would expect an all concrete structure to be cold and stark, but it's the way he deals with the light. It watercolors down the arches, and I always feel liquid, like warm in those spaces. So I'm going to try to play that game, and with all the rest of the materials as much monolithic as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So that I'm dealing with, I guess, structural problem resolution rather than just building brick by brick. It's more assemblage kind of thing. So, so not thatch. Yeah.
So I'm going to read 2 paragraphs. And this is going to be a visit to the Algany, and then we'll wrap up for this week. And but you're going to be welcome to say anything you want. This is an interesting 2 paragraphs. So paragraphs 276 and 277. The Algany, natives of the Elgon forests of Central Africa, explained to me that there are 2 kinds of dreams: the ordinary dream of the little man and the big vision that only the great man has. For example, the medicine man or the chief. Little dreams are of no account, but if a man has a big dream, he summons the whole tribe in order to tell it to everybody. How is a man to know whether his dream is big or little one? He knows it by an instinctive feeling of significance. He feels so overwhelmed by the impression it makes that he would never think of keeping the dream to himself. He has to tell it on the psychologically correct assumption that it is of general significance. Even with us, the collective dream has a feeling of importance about it that impels communication. It springs from a conflicted relationship and must therefore be built into the conscious relations because it compensates these and not just some inner personal quirk. Okay.
I love the responsibility to share what we find when we return, because we each have our own personal unconscious. We each are unconscious differently. And I think that, I, Annabelle, you, we will never think or feel the same. So there's a community learning gift I find there, where we bring back our unconscious contents and we share them, whether it's directly discussion, talking about them, or through art, through the creation where they're coming from. So I just really like the big dreams that he has to share this. And so it's something for the community.
Right. And, there's the big dream of the person who's a real chief and shares them for the benefit of all. And then the counterpoint to that is the individual who only shares it for his benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, there's a couple of other questions here, but does either of you want to comment here on these 2 paragraphs? And we'll stop there. further comment.
I just like that, because it compensates these, and not just some inner personal quirk, that there's substance to offer, regardless when something is significant. And in a sense, I would say if I feel moved, that's something to, that's not just for me. That's something important to share.
Righto. Okay, righto. I rarely get that with respect to dreams, but I do get it with respect to visions very often.
It's interesting you say that, because I look at remembered dreams are most likely messages. And
so are visions.
And visions, though, are messages. I mean, to me, the remembered dreams are most likely messages, or something to chew on, or swim in kind of thing. But then the visions definitely are, okay, something's telling me something. Don't close the ears. Listen. Man, this is going to be great on July 4th. I'm my own little firework here. I don't know what's going on with this background thing.
Yeah.
Well, what you're saying about messages coming from dreams or from visions, Jordan, I mean, I have so many messages that come from, some little thing that I notice on the sidewalk, or
Can be that.
the person who walks up to the house where I'm sitting in the living room and they knock on the window. And some of this, I think, really has been influenced by and informed by the fact that toward the end of my father's life, he was slipping in between those worlds of dream and waking life in a much more visible way than I'm used to seeing in anyone, right? And he was existing somewhere in that limbo that was between the dreams and the waking life. And I think that it has helped me pick up on what I think one of the words that you're sort of implying there is clues, right?
Yes.
There are these clues to directions that really are all around us. I'm in a little writing workshop, and I have any number of artworks and photographs, all around me in this apartment. And one of the people in the group might give a prompt or, suggest something in order to just throw us off balance a little bit so that we approach our material in a new way. We all know what we're working on, but we're trying to kind of surprise ourselves. And so I'll hear something, maybe they'll say, think about a flute that's made out of wood. That's not a flute made out of metal, but a flute made out of wood. And then I'll just look around my room, and then something in front of me, the wooden frame around that particular photograph, or this little wooden stick that broke off of something that hasn't been fixed yet, or this wooden, I keep files in boxes, most of them are cardboard, but this particular one is wooden, just something to kind of set it off. And I'll find that my very same environment that I look at every day, there's something completely new to me.
That really is so resonant, because when I first moved to Taos last year, I just started, I was stunned at how many synchronicities. It's like, wow, this is just fit. But then I realized I was walking down the street pulling my little cart to go down to the plaza with everything, and I call it my little Mars rover, little cobalt Mars rover. And this tiger swallowtail butterfly was just right at my shoulder, and it followed me for 3 blocks. When I would stop at an intersection, it's just hovering right there. 3 blocks. I'm just like, this is good. This is totem level good. But then walking home, I'm like, well, where's the butterfly? Who's going to walk me home? Almost like a little kid, going to school and come back. But I started to notice synchronicities all the time. Like, I look up and see a face in a tree, but it would strike me more strongly than it did in the last, say, 6 years.
Perfect.
And I finally realized I slowed, not go slow to go faster. I had slowed down to synchronize with myself and the place. And I realized these things had always been happening this much, if not more.
Mhm.
And just like you said, you just look and see I'll see a crack in the sidewalk, or the way a bee lands or doesn't, or just anything.
Mhm.
And you get that concrete communication as if nature is speaking directly to you. And
It is speaking directly to us.
yeah,
it surely
completely.
is.
And so instead
you're recognizing that.
Yeah.
And so I started to notice, it's like driving a standard transmission. If the synchronicities start to diminish more than, ebb and flow, like you're going to expect the difference. It's not going to be flatlined the same all the time. But there's pause, take a breath. Do I need to upshift, downshift? Where have I kind of gotten off track in a way? And it's a great clue to just the connection. And also then to pause and to rest, and don't be so connected all the time. That's a recipe too. But at the same time, there's no need to disconnect. Your focus is gonna dwindle here and there. So I think there's a certain lazy thing that can streak through and is a positive force.
Lazy can be really good. Lazy can help.
Well, what does Bill Gates says? I will give my most complex problem to the laziest person because they'll find the easiest way to do it.
There you go.
Right.
Okay,
well, there's also that great Buddhist expression, don't just do something, sit there.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's sort of sort of an answer to what Josh Cohen is asking on YouTube. So we'll finish with Josh's comments. I'm not sure we have the answers, Josh. None of us are mental health professionals, but we'll at least put your questions out there. He says, "Hey there, friends. Was just trying to make sense of some Jungian ideas and came on to YouTube to see if you guys were meeting. Happy to see that you are. Maybe you can shed light on my question. Can complexes be thought of as the meaning making units of the psyche? Jung did say that they are building blocks of the psyche and responsible for emotions, that the personal unconscious is where consciousness meets the truly collective unconscious, where the exterior world meets the interior psychic world. Also considering how complexes tie together ideas, emotions, and behaviors through association, it seems like complexes might function as our basic meaning-making units." Comments?
I think I have a question to the question that is not to clarify the question, but to add into the question. Are complexes superficial things to be cured or evolved, or are complexes natural city inhabitants, so to speak, of the psyche?
The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both.
Right. And so, Josh, I don't think that complexes are the only meaning-making function of the unconscious, and a lot of things go on in the unconscious and in the conscious mind. Oh, excuse me, it's getting late. That direct our behavior, let's say, that are well beyond personal complexes. Not the least of which is, if you watch the talking heads on cable news, you'll see how we're pushed and shoved one way or the other. People want us to do things. If you just watch the advertisers, holy smokes, all day long, we're bombarded these days with all the sicknesses that we can have in life. If you're a hypochondriac, boy, don't turn on the television because
my favorite one is, do you wake up tired in the morning? I'm like, oh my God, write this down. I have this. It's like,
right. And the consequences of this medicine could be death. Right?
could be death. Yeah, suicidal thoughts, death.
Right.
I mean, it's like, wow, I think I'll stay with the cold that I have. Just a little damage control or something. You know, it's like, yeah, there's a comedian, Lazy Boy, who did Lazy Boy TV, and he had a whole segment on, this is like in 2002, a segment on psych meds and their commercials. And he goes, wow, look at this happy commercial. What's herpes? But I don't know what it is, but how can I get that? Look, it comes with a hot chick and a puppy and a kite in the park. You know, it's all happy that you're suffering. You know, it's like, you know, it's giving people this false sense of hope of, oh, you know, it's going to. So anyway, but it's the same thing. And so, you know, Annabelle, you're directly there. You're probably the one who's giving us so much. Are you the one writing all of our humorous,
the pharmaceutical ads,
the pharma commercials? I mean,
yeah,
you're probably editing these things of, you know.
Well, I don't write anything. And
editing. Okay.
Years ago, when I started doing this kind of editing, only because it's the highest paid of any particular industry in general of editing. So that's why I veered in that direction. But I asked friends of mine who had, you know, found me a little niche in their editing. And I said, well, maybe I should, you know, graduate to copy soup, it's called, which is copy supervisor, right? And you're actually writing this stuff, but you aren't actually writing anything. It's FDA's language for what you can and can't say. And then you're really in the tangle because it is a very doublespeak world. I mean, it's completely Orwellian. I mean, recently when Moderna vaccine, and I mean, recent in COVID, it actually is not quite so recent because we have so many dramatic chapters in this, you know, evolving pandemic globally. But at that point, when Moderna said, no, we don't want to, you know, give away our vaccines, and we don't want to share our, you know, our recipes, and we don't want to give up, you know, any of our profit margin. We don't care that it was American taxpayers who gave us all the money in order to do the research that we did, right? I mean, that's the Orwellian corner. And besides the really dark corner of it, that just surface corner of like, so these companies are developing drugs, whatever your definition of drugs is, to heal, whatever your definition of healing is, citizens, you know, of the world, whatever your little corner of the world is, where maybe you have socialized medicine and maybe you don't, and maybe you have to pay a copay and maybe you don't, and maybe you have to do this, maybe you don't, and it's just I mean, that's why I use that word tangle. It's an incredible tangle. So all I pay attention to is commas, apostrophes, capitalizations. That's it.
Okay. that actually makes a lot of sense with the Orwellian piece where, hi, we're going to have you fund us. We're going to give you something in return, but you don't get any part of the profits. Thanks for paying for us to profit. I mean, it's like the nation is a patron.
Well, people right now are saying that about Boeing and Raytheon and some, you know, some of these other arms, you know, weapons manufacturers. How is that? Is that really helping the American people? I don't know. And is it actually producing a huge profit margin? I don't know. I mean, Skip, you know a lot more about that side of, you know, how the world operates.
Well, surely it's hugely profitable. I mean, it costs about $1 billion to develop a drug, but then you make huge money, and sometimes you just make huge money from stupid people. Like I have a drug that was introduced to me 6 months ago, and I'm a retired officer, so normally I pay nothing for drugs
Right.
because the Marine Corps takes care of it.
So that's
And-
normal for you. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that all I pay is a service charge to the drugstore so that I don't have to physically go to some military base to get my drugs. Okay. Whatever it is. And I don't mean I don't mean
Right.
illicit drugs. I mean things I take like statin drugs and that sort of thing. But okay, so this new drug comes in, and this is happening to me right now. And they want, because it's a trial drug, they want me to pay $68 instead of nothing, right? And so with the service fee, it would be $80. And so I finally, I said to the doctor, well, I don't think this is doing anything. And he says, well, go off it and let's see what happens. And so I went off it for about 10 days, and I found out that the doctor was right, and it was making my life better. And so I went back on it. And so the last time I had gotten 90 days supply for $68, so $22 a month or something. But this week, the doctor wrote the prescription, it turns out accidentally, for 30 days, and they wanted $68. And so, yeah, and so I said, no, wait a minute. Now this drug is $68 for 30 days and not for 90. But come to find out that, and this is a trick, so I'm letting people know what the trick is so you can watch out for it, is that if your doctor doesn't write it for 90 days and writes it for 30 days at a time, you're going to have to pay a copay every time.
Right.
And that $68 is the copay. Okay. And so she said, well, we'll go back to the doctor and get him to write it for 90 days, which is what he had intended anyway. And then it'll still be $68. So that was the secret. The secret was, which they wouldn't tell you and wouldn't tell me until I, started to pound on the desk a little bit. Not hard, but in any case, because I actually like the pharmacist, so I'm very kind to her. But the point was that if I hadn't pressed the issue, I wouldn't have gotten to the bottom of the fact that I was being paid $68 times 3 for 90 days now, but it was because the doctor wrote the prescription for 30 days instead of 90. And if he simply changed the prescription to 90 days, it would still be $68 because that is the copay.
Right.
And so each 30-day quantity required a copay, understandably. But if I got the doctor to write it 90 days, $68 for 90 days. So anyway, you have to be very careful about how they're screwing with you and that sort of thing.
That actually solves. Now I get it. When I got Lyme's disease back in 2006, when I was in Philly, the doxycycline, they gave me is it a 10 or 20 day supply until the test results come back. And if you're positive, then they do another 10 or something like that. I think it's 10 days and then another 10. But so I paid like $50 or whatever for the first 10 days. But then they're like, yeah, your test results came back full band. You've had it for over 90. We need to knock this out. So they did 20 more days. And when I went into the pharmacy to pick it up, I'm like expecting, 20 more days. That's going to be $100, because I was equating, and they're like, that'll be $3.12. And I'm like, what? They're like, oh, well, your first prescription was still processing, so the copay applies to this one now too, and you've already paid that. And I went, oh. But so now I realize why I paid $3.12 for twice the amount that I did the first time.
Right. And so now I think it'll get straightened out for me. Okay, so there's one final thing that Josh says here that I'm going to read. He says, it seems like many things for Jung were defined with both positive and negative functioning. Yes, Josh, that's correct. We're not going to answer these big questions that you're dropping at when it's at 10 o'clock at night.
I did have one further thought on the complexes question.
Okay.
And it's brief. I wonder if the complexes are certainly not the meaning makers, but they are more the multiple libraries of Alexandria within that we interpret the conscious contents filter through to give us the meaning. But in a sense, correlation does not equal causation. That picture I have with the cat, and as he has mentioned earlier, that etiological, that's cause, going back to primary cause.
Right.
That I don't think the complexes possibly are the cause of the meaning, being the meaning makers. They're just the voice that is kind of the unconscious, what the unconscious filters through for us to navigate. So anyway, I'll stop there because it's kind of a circular thinking.
Yeah, and it's a bottomless pit that we never get to the bottom of.
Yeah, exactly.
Annabelle, do you have anything else to say before we
I think we said a lot tonight, but when I get off this call, and I'm going to be curling up with my copy of Jung's, it's not Jung's book, it's some other editor or woman, I forgot her name, but On Nature, where it pulls out. And I saw that this next paragraph goes right into that, the Ilongi natives of the Elgon forest, right? That's where I'm going right now. It's such a pleasurable book, the way that writer, it's a little bit like a Cliff's Notes of a certain thread of Jung's writing that is so relaxing.
So there's a synchronicity, and I'm going to ask you to give us a report on this book next week.
Sure. Yeah, I may be here next week. I have had to miss some Mondays, and I've been sad to miss them, but next Monday I may very well be here. So, yes.
Well, great. If you're not, then you can do it whenever
I'll save my book review for now.
Right.
But it's not going to be a review. It's really a book to reflect on, and it's just delightful. It's all his words, but they're kind of pulled out in that way that, it's part of what we do when we're reading, and then we kind of sift out what has the most meaning for us here. And this editor seems to have done that for herself in some way.
Congratulations again, Bota. That's
well, I'm only part way. Now I've got the whole minor arcana, but it does feel like I have reached, a new beginning. Let's call it that. A new beginning.
Only 66 cards to go.
Not much to go. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I remember that when I finished the major arcana in my deck, I went, oh, sweet. I only have just shy of 70 more cards to do.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
But it's a different process. I already feel that.
Yes, it is.
This is a different process.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because the major arcana are the archetypes, but the minor arcana are the way it is in the world.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
And the major arcana did seem to be what I had, heard whispers of, that I got through 10 or 11, whatever it was. And then it was sort of like beginning again, and it was harder.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah.
And things in my life got bigger and more, sort of grand scale. It's
Yeah.
wild, you know? I mean,
Surely it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
I find it, I'm so glad you're doing that too, because across the years since I created a non-derivative, so I designed the whole thing, of course, coloring while you're doing it.
Right.
But I've talking to people who've done the same process, just the coloration, whether they went by traditional colors or they went with what resonated with them, having conversations with them. I remember one day going, wow, if I didn't know that you colored your bota, I would assume that you had obviously authored your tarot deck, because your communication and dialogue with the cards is so one-on-one direct. And they would have a lot of the same or similar realizations I had from starting from scratch. And I just love that total immersion just in the coloration.
Yes.
It's such a brilliantly informing, it's like informing your intuition kind of process. And you literally begin to live the cards and without being dissolved, you can play the character.
So ladies and gentlemen on YouTube, we are talking about the Bota deck, BOTA deck. And it is a deck of tarot cards that are only presented in outline form, like a coloring book, not fully colored out. And so what Annabelle is talking about is an experience that she has been having over the last year in filling in the cards one a week and seeing what happens, how that communicates with her unconscious. Is that fair enough, Annabelle?
Yeah, the only thing I would dispute in your terminology about it is saying one a week makes it sound as though the time frame is something that corresponds to a calendar that we're familiar with. And this is one of the things that I was going to respond to what Jordan was saying about, is that it's all occurring on many different levels, let's say, of consciousness or paying alertness.
Right. Fair enough. Good point.
That moment when I know that I'm ready to paint the card is a very good practice kind of inner monologue with myself. Because when I see the card unpainted and I know what I have just completed, and I look at that card and I read some things, and I, walk down the street and a pigeon flies by my ear, or any of these things that we're talking about here, all these things are happening, and that card is sort of present for me. It's almost like a little invisible companion. And then at a certain point, that's an indescribable point in time. And it is a little bit the way, Skip, you talked about writing your poem, and you talked about that snowstorm. It's like those moments that I say, I'm going to paint it tonight, which means I'm going to paint it within the next hour. I'm going to have a cup of water, and I'm going to have a brush, and I'm going to have the paints, and I don't know what color I'm going to do it. And I may look some things up or read a little Jodorowsky or do something, but I know that I'm ready, because what I'm doing is I'm completing my process with that card, and I cannot describe what that is in any rational, linear way. It's just a knowing. And that knowing reminds me, each time that I know that, it reminds me that I know everything.
You go. There you go. That's right.
It all lives within. That's interesting you say that, because every once in a while, no matter what I'm doing, all of a sudden it's time. I mean, out loud. And I look, and it's not from like an alternate personality. It's like a burp in a sense. It just came from somewhere inside. It's time, and I will go, whoa. And I remember being in a meeting, and I was about to present, and I stood up and started to walk out. They're like, "Where are you going?" It's time. And And I went back, back to my office, and because it was something that was like that. It was indescribable, and I knew, don't resist, do not resist.
No, you
He
can't.
won't ask me twice.
Yeah.
You can't with this process. You can't resist, because there is nothing else. There's nothing you can turn to that says, oh no, I'm wrong, or oh no, it's too late, or oh no, it's too early, or no, I don't have any water. I mean, it's a funny, there's a funny way that knowing happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
So.
I mean, so many people in the world, and this I encounter through that farmer world, so many people in the world, they don't know when they're hungry. They don't know when they're tired. And that has been me. I have gone through many experiences in time when I didn't know I was tired, or I didn't know that I was hungry, or I didn't, some of this basic stuff. So when I'm knowing it's time to paint a card, I'm also knowing, oh, right, that's a reminder. When I'm hungry, I know I'm hungry, and I do something about it.
Can I ask you a quick process question about your plans for the minor? Are you minors? Are you going to do suit by suit, or are you going to go twos and threes, or I mean, are you going to be bouncing around, or?
No, I'm going to be doing it in the order that the Bota deck is. But believe me, this question you're asking me, I was wondering it as I was getting ready for the world. Let's call it that, because literally I was getting ready for the world, for that card. But once I got to the world card, I knew that when I went in my little package that I got from the Bota people, and I had also discussed it with other people. Oh, I think I should be doing Pentacles next. Oh, I think this, I think that. I can think anything I want. I go in that box, I get the next card. That's what it is, and I showed you that was what it is. It's one. Right. So I'm just going in the order of the process that I accepted on day one. When Nick said, why don't you paint the Bota cards now? And I said, okay, that means I got a box of cards, pulled out one. It was the 0 card. It was the Fool. I went spinning around thinking about the Fool for about a week, 10 days. I don't know, and then I thought, oh, I should keep a calendar of this, and then I thought, no, I'm not doing this on a calendar. I don't need to remember these dates because I'm in it. And that's the thing about like that body of water, right? We're just swimming in it.
Right. And that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
When if you know, you'll know it.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, when you know what we're talking about, you'll know it.
Yeah.
And if anything, I've learned, so to speak, because it's not a learn, it's an unlearn.
Right.
The most important thing I learned was to be comfortable with the not knowing.
Exactly.
And that made my life so much better. Instead of, I gotta, show my work. No, you don't. Finish and polish. Well, that'll happen at the end. Don't worry about it right now. I mean, it's. Okay,
I gotta quit.
Good to see you guys.
Great idea. Okay.
Thanks. See you next week. Bye bye. Thanks.